Hello everyone. I wanted to do something a little bit different in showing you the fights for my featherweight combat robot Crippling Depression at Motorama 2018. Instead of just releasing the fights individually on my channel with no real commentary or pictures or anything else, I wanted to kind of put together a simple compilation of all the fights in chronological order as they happened to give you a little bit better idea of how I worked my way through the brackets. I ended up getting second place at Motorama for the featherweight division, and I also ended up winning the coveted Coolest Robot at Motorama award, which is really cool because this is actually across all the weight classes. They had ants, they had beetles, they had sportsmen, 12 pounds, and then also the featherweight. So there's a lot of different robots there. There's actually quite a bit of robots there, so it was really good to win the coolest overall robot. And I did take a lot of damage. I had a lot of really hard fights with a lot of really good competitors, so yeah, we'll get into that later. Also, if you look down in the description below, I have the markers for the starts of each fight, so if you don't want to hear me talk and just want to go straight to the fights, check the description down below, and let's start with the very first fight. My very first fight at Motorama was up against Emulsifier. Emulsifier was a big vertical spinner with a wedge up front. It was a relatively new robot, but it had a really large weapon on the front of it, a scoop on it, and at the last minute they added these little wings on the outside to try and prevent me from getting at the wheels. My whole strategy with them was actually to ride up on that front wedge, hit the weapon, hopefully, maybe get something out of alignment and stop their weapon from spinning, and then just go after the wheels. So let's see how that went.
3, 2, 1, fight! Trying to get the job that way. Hard rating coming on.
Overall, it was a pretty good first fight for me to have. At the very end, you saw that I took off one of the wheels. I took very little damage to the robot itself, a couple little nicks, a couple little scratches right there. I think they had some issues getting their weapon up to speed. The other thing to point out with their weapon is I did actually get a couple good hits on their weapon when they're upside down and actually kind of split the laminations on the aluminum versus the insert. So that was pretty nasty. And I got a couple little scrapes on the bottom, which just made some of those screws really difficult to extract. So next up is Huge. Huge is a very interesting and non-traditional robot. A lot of robot builders are aware of what Huge is, but for those of you that aren't familiar, it actually has kind of a plastic body up top, and then it has these huge UHMW wheels on the outside, and it's very difficult to grab a hold of because it's so much taller than all the other robots. And spinning discs like mine really aren't all that effective because it just kind of pushes away the wheels. So I had two kind of plans. The first plan was to use my biggest tooth weapon, which has the most bite or grab in it, and then run upside down so that the weapon was actually on top of the robot. This would allow me to try and get up a little bit higher on the wheels, hopefully maybe hook into one of the wheels, snap it, do something like that. If that failed, I would go to another strategy, which was to line up directly with the big vertical disc that spins in the middle of Huge and line up and just basically try and hit the weapon directly, hoping that the structure would fail. So let's see how that went.
3, 2, 1. 10, 9, 8, just gone? Oh, what happened?
Tapped out.
All right, who's that? You okay, all right. Well, in that case, you're a winner by questionable crippling depression.
So thankfully the strategy of hitting weapon to weapon seems to work out really well. In the pits I was actually looking at Huge before the fight, and I noticed that there's really not too much connecting the left side and the right side of the robot. There's just a couple really small shafts. So if I figure I put some stress right down the middle of that, I might get a result like it actually snapping in half. So that was actually pretty cool. The confusion that you see towards the end is you can see that Huge actually kind of taps out after it gets broken, but then they continue to move around. So the judges, the audience, and myself were kind of confused whether they tapped out or didn't tap out, and since I was no longer moving at the end, there was some confusion as to whether I tapped out or they tapped out, so that was kind of weird. In terms of damage, they hit me one really good time on the underneath side. There's so much damage it's hard to isolate, but they basically chipped one of the edges. I think it's one of the edges over here, chipped that and actually bent in the bottom titanium armor a little bit, so that sound you heard and a little bit of sparks you heard was actually just rubbing against the bottom titanium armor, and that was just pretty easily fixed just by hammering out that titanium, and I was good to go for the next fight, which was totally not Overhaul. The next fight I had was up against Charles' robot. Can't believe it's not Overhaul, and for the sake of this video I'm just going to call it Overhaul. It is a 30-pound version of his BattleBots robot Overhaul. And it's a very interesting robot. It's extremely well driven, it's extremely well balanced, and it has this kind of gripper, clamper, lifter arm in the middle, which is actually really effective, and in some of the other fights in the competition it really, really did well. So I really wasn't sure how he was going to approach my robot, since it's really not the easiest thing to kind of clamp and lift around, especially with the forces of this weapon. So for that battle, I just kind of went into it not really knowing what to expect. Thankfully, it is relatively low to the ground and has a lot of wedges and kind of sharp bits to grab a hold of. So let's see how that went. The fight with Overhaul was a little bit more strategic and a little bit more pushing match, so thankfully I was happy with how the drive system of Crippling Depression performed, because Charles has a really, really good drive system on Overhaul, so that was good. And towards the end of the fight, he actually lost one of the drives on the robot, and that's what caused him to tap out. And halfway through the fight, you saw that he actually kind of lifted that lifter mechanism halfway up to keep it from getting damaged or possibly getting high-sided. And I did actually do a bit of damage to all the front forks, kind of rendering them useless because they're all just kind of bent away. And also on the underside, he sits up just enough that the weapon was able to get kind of underneath the robot and just kind of shear off a lot of the screw heads underneath, which made repairing it really a pain in the butt. I didn't have really that much damage afterwards from Overhaul because it was, you know, more of a pushing strategy match. So then it was on to my next fight, Marathon. The next fight was against Marathon, and Marathon is a very well-built, very solid drum spinning robot. It's relatively new, but it is from a very seasoned robot builder, so I was kind of not really sure what to expect. It's a very well-made bot, but it does have a lot of aluminum, but there's not a lot of stuff to get to. My original strategy was actually to try and get against that front lip. That proved to be really difficult, so then I tried to go after the wheels, maybe go after the drum, and it's just a very difficult robot to get into, and I was really not too keen on the idea of facing a powerful drum spinner. So let's see how that went.
Ready to go. Let's put 3 minutes on the clock, please.
Fight, robots, fight! Both robots up to speed instantly. That first big hit, he sparks.
That scoop on the bottom of Marathon, specifically put on for this fight to get underneath that disc. Tire gone on Marathon.
Crippling depression, pushing him into the arena. Crippling depression trying to give the robot a wheelectomy. The Brazilian rub. Crippling depression can hover? Marathon, we need to see some movement, please, sir. Forward, there we go. Judges are nodding their head. That's good enough. Crippling depression lining up for another hit attack. Right on the corner. Titanium sparks. Oh!
That was a
Marathon movement.
Marathon, we need some controlled movement here. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, knockout.
Your winner by knockout, Crippling Depression.
When fighting Marathon, I actually ran the weapon faster than normal because I wanted to leverage the gyroscopic forces of the spinner to counteract his drum spinner. So if you watch the fight, you can see that when I hit the drum, I kind of just popped straight up and straight back down. Whereas if I didn't have the weapon spinning, I would have kind of flipped, you know, end over end or flipped up. So that force of the weapon spinning actually helped to stabilize me a little bit and to kind of put some energy back into his weapon. Ultimately, what happened is I caught the underneath side of the titanium and flayed that out, and also kind of nicked one of the wheels, so one of the wheels stopped driving and then it became high-sided. So just a couple big hits that were well placed ended up ending that match. The next one was Burnout. Burnout was probably the first robot that I faced that really made me nervous. It made me nervous because I had a couple good fights previously in the day, and also the geometry really wasn't well suited for me. It didn't have any wedges. The wheels were kind of all the way in the back, protected by this big disc. It was a horizontal spinner that had kind of a steel body, and then that disc was just up front protecting everything, and I just didn't have the reach to really get at anything. So unfortunately for this, the strategy with Crippling Depression was to hit the weapon as much as possible and try and break the weapon and then go after the wheel. Let's check it out. First off, I want to apologize for a lot of the fight happening kind of outside of the corner. Unfortunately, I just didn't have a good video footage for this fight. But thankfully, the strategy worked. It worked at a great cost to the outer frame of Crippling Depression. A lot of these gouges that you can see in the front, these are all from Burnout. And up until this point, I unfortunately didn't take pictures throughout the event, but up until that fight, Crippling Depression looked pretty much new. It had a couple little scratches and scuffs here and there, but it looked like it was in really good condition. And all of these pig gouges in the front came from Burnout. And it did actually have one big issue, which was when the weapon came around, it kind of split out the side rail a little bit and busted one of these screws. So I had to remove that screw and then kind of pound it back in place. And actually after that, it was pretty okay, but it did end up kind of compromising this corner a little bit. For Burnout specifically, just the repeated hit over and over and over to that front of the weapon. I think he said the weapon belt actually came off, so the weapon stopped working, and as soon as the weapon stopped working, I kind of just relaxed a little bit and then just went after the wheels. And one of the wheels that I went after at the very end, you can kind of see roll up into the frame, actually bent the shaft on his drive motor as well. So it was a very hard-earned victory. It took a lot of time to get to that point, and I took a lot of damage from it, but still really nothing that needed to be replaced or fixed in the robot, just a little bit of pounding back in place. And now at this point, I'm in the finals, so I had to wait and see who won the losers bracket and then fight them, and that was Megatron, last year's champion. Megatron was one of the robots that I was wanting to fight but not looking forward to fighting. Is a really great robot, but the geometry and everything else just really doesn't work well with me. It's kind of this scoop, almost dustpan type robot that has an arm on the back that has a spinning weapon that kind of comes down over top. Crippling Depression is really not designed for overhead weapons, as they're kind of not really in style right now, so there really aren't that many overhead weapons. And also because of the large scoop format of Megatron, it's relatively easy for it to be picked up from the front and then driven around the arena. And it also has a really good lip on the front that I can't really get to with my weapon. So for the first fight against Megatron, I decided to actually run upside down. Once again, run the weapon on top of the robot, hoping that that would dissuade Megatron from using the overhead weapon, because if you use the overhead weapon, it would just go weapon to weapon, and that arm that kind of moves back and forth would just get caught by my weapon and get ripped off. So hopefully I can run upside down, and let's see how that went.
We're
As you can see, this was a very difficult and very long and strategic match, and it definitely should have gone to Megatron. I did a little bit of damage towards the end, but they definitely showed more control and I guess, you know, more aggression throughout the whole fight. I was just kind of flailing around in, you know, this dangerous weapon. But running upside down and running full speed, you can definitely see the gyroscopic forces at play and just how dangerous this weapon can be. So ultimately, I think running upside down was probably the safest bet. I really didn't take much damage from that fight. I literally just popped in the new battery, recharged, and went for the next fight. But because this is double elimination, he had to beat me twice in a row. So for the next iteration of fighting Megatron, I decided to actually run with the weapon down in the normal configuration, hoping that I could maybe grab something else. I guess fortunately and unfortunately that match didn't last that long. Running in the normal configuration just was, not the right way to beat Megatron or try to beat Megatron. The robot is just so wide that trying to get all the way around to either the backside or to the wheels was nearly impossible. He just had a lot more traction and better drive, and it was just really hard to get to anything good on him other than that front wedge. And those overhead blows were actually very disconcerting. They didn't really do any damage other than cosmetic, which was substantial. There was substantial cosmetic damage done, and I'm going to have to completely redo this whole frame because of that. But I thought at the time it actually got to some vital innards. It turns out that the weapon was actually slightly off kilter and was actually rubbing against the frame, which was causing the frame to heat up, and it actually ended up melting some wires, and those were the signal wires for the drive, and that is why I ended up tapping out towards the end, because I lost the drive and just couldn't respond, and he was going to come down once again with that overhead weapon. So I learned a lot in that competition, and the various different types of robots that Crippling Depression is good at and not so good at. So I'd like to thank everyone that was involved with Motorama, of course. For the footage, I'd like to thank WPI Robotics Club, who provided one or two of the clips, as well as Kyle Singer, who helped with some of the clips as well. And then, of course, Ken Franklin, who did all of the great photos during the competition, and I used a couple of those photos, so give thanks to all those guys, and you can check the description down below for some links and whatnot. So time to move on to version 3 of Crippling Depression. See that in about 6 months or so, and see you next time.